Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for this second edition of Kyte Talks. Today we talk about ISO 27001. It is a standard which requires no introduction because in many ways it is the de facto standard for information security. But it also happens to be gaining a lot of popularity as more and more companies are choosing to get themselves certified to this standard. Today we discuss those questions, concerns and issues that one would face when they embark on this project to get themselves compliant and eventually get themselves certified as well. My name is Trevor Asha, I'm the director at Kyte Global, and with me today I have three guests. In the same way that we had three guests as well last month when we spoke about the DORA regulation, today we have a new discussion and three new guests. And I'll proceed to introduce them. So we have James Miles, who is a consultant for several companies and has several years of experience in helping clients get themselves compliant to ISO 27001. Vedran Kunovic, who is an auditor and a consultant for Bureau Veritas, which is a certification body. And we have Brian Vassallo, who is an IT auditor with us here at Kyte Global. Guys, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
So, as I said in the introduction, ISO 27001 is getting very popular. It has existed for a number of years, but it's getting more and more popular. James, I start with you. Why this importance around ISO 27001, especially getting certification? What are really the benefits of getting yourself certified to ISO?
Well, for most of our clients where we implement ISO 27001, they're regulated gambling companies. So for them, they just need to have it. All the different territories have got different requirements depending on whether you need to do penetration testing, whether you have to change your auditor from time to time. But a commonality is that most of the territories now want something either ISO 27001 or something akin to that. We do a lot of work with UK companies who are required to do a section of ISO 27001, and that's under a less stringent audit regime than the full standard. The advantages they find, other than the fact that they just need it for their operation, are the same benefits that we see for other companies. So they come to realise that it allows them to show a level of compliance to their investors, for example, and that often comes as a surprise when people look for to sell the company or to have an investment, that you'll find that the due diligence process is far easier when that happens. And for our clients, those and others who aren't in the gaming industry, we've got all the normal advantages of being able to assure yourself and assure other third parties that you work with that you have that you've put effort into it. Because if you don't have an actual standard, then what are you testing against? There are other certifications in information security that are useful, and some governments require them. In fact, sometimes they require those and not necessarily 27001. But as a global standard and something that everyone recognises, then ISO 27001 is what you want to have.
Adding to James as well there, since this is a really competitive marketplace as well, and where you have data breaches and cybersecurity threats which are looming large basically nowadays, having an ISO certification of like 27001 can also differentiate you from others. So it will also give you like a competitive advantage on the marketplace. It's not an uncommon thing where we had clients which would consult us with regards to, can I gain this ISO certification to help me win businesses, etc.
It's a relatively uncommon standard at the moment. in regards to the other standards, but definitely one thing to present as specific to the market.
Yeah, yeah. And we're seeing, as you mentioned, James, as well, the regulators themselves have now realized, you know, even though they do come up with several requirements, guidance documents and whatever, but the ISO standard continues to be like their yardstick when it comes to putting in place requirements for the licensees. Okay, I want to jump into what I believe is one of the most important questions, and I'll ask you, Vedran. When it comes to the scope, right? It's a very good thing that this is recorded, because this is a question that comes up every single time. And I know that I call on you very often to help explain this to clients. So when it comes to the scope, do I get to have a say into the scope that I choose? Is it up to me, or are there rules around the scoping?
Okay, so the scope is initially determined by the client. If you don't need your whole company to get certified, okay, you can of course select a part of the activities that you are covering. But basically there are some rules that should be followed in order to get certified. So you cannot say, okay, I'm not going to select IT, for example, and select this is not going to go in the scope. The standard and the new revision of standard is relying on 4 areas, and one of those is definitely IT. But there are other parts that should be certified as well. So procurement as a process, whether it directly relies within the IT, or whether it is close connected or connected as a different organizational unit, should be there. Human resources are also pretty much significantly influencing the scope. And yes, of course, the management or the part of management that is targeting to be certified cannot be excluded. So basically there are different organizational parts that should be certified within a single certification, but it depends on the client size and client targets and expectation for certification. So there are the different things to be introduced when you are implementing 27.1, and if you would like to get certified, but the scope is, as you said, a crucial one to figure it out to start.
I would imagine then that as long as the mandatory aspects of my environment are included in the scope, I can choose to go small at the beginning, right? As small as possible, and then potentially increase the scope in future, in further years.
This is, as I would suggest from time to time to different clients, this is sometimes a good approach, because the requirements of the standard are relatively strict. So if you are going to push it through the company without any experience and without any experience to the other standards, then you can have a problem, because there is a whole lot of job to be done there. If there is some experience with other standards and with good implementation of other standards, it can be implemented more broadly, and you can define it there on core processes and non-core. Usually there are some larger clients that initially goes with non-core processes and then jump in and expand their certification on core processes.
Yeah, because there is, I suppose, also an element of your employees have to get accustomed and they have to accept, right, this change, which, let's face it, it is a big change.
Yeah, that's awareness situation. The consultants are also going to confirm it. It's a huge thing, because sometimes it's easy to implement even technical changes within the organization, but the awareness is always there. And when you need to distribute it through your employees, and not even to them, to your suppliers as well, at that point you need a hard bite there, definitely.
One of the biggest issues with scope is when you're trying to give that assurance to another party. So whenever someone tells us we can do business with you because we have ISO 27001, I'm like, show me the scope. because some people just want to get an easy ISO.
Yeah.
So you really have to get a hold of that scope and say, I can't just tick the box because you've got this standard. I have to see that actually covered the areas where it's relevant to our mutual assurance.
Yeah. Because I suppose, it is, when you get yourself certified, it is one of those, let's say, stamps that you want to put even on your website, right? But as you said, it depends on what exactly your scope was.
Yeah. And especially when you see an organisation that tells you how easy it was and they got it no problem, they had no issues in their audit.
Red flags.
We got it in weeks. The first thing I'm thinking is, what have you actually audited? And that's the scope.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I suppose it applies to every standard out there, but we use certification and compliance interchangeably sometimes, right? And getting yourself compliant, which might just mean you've aligned your processes to the standard, is somewhat different to getting yourself certified, right? The process is a bit more rigorous than that. But we get to see sometimes these words being used, yes, we are compliant. And that when you dig deeper, then sometimes you find, okay, they've put in place policies, right? And that's not really all that there's to it, obviously. Another thing with regards to the scope that and I know I'm spending some time on this topic because I think this is very, very important, but when it comes to the scope, is you get companies that are part of a group, right? Sometimes they are individual companies owned by the same parent company. Sometimes it is a group arrangement, or else, yes, companies with common ownership, but then there are resource sharing agreements, for example, between them. How would that fit into choosing which entity needs to get certified? So which entity needs to be in the scope? Because I suppose the client is always going to tell you, I want everyone mentioned on the certificate, right? But how does that work?
Yeah, initially, and the key issue there, if there are the companies that are on different levels of maturity there. So basically, if you have some experienced company that also have some experience with financial or other markets that are relatively strict, we can say that it's going to be easy for them. It's not, but we can see that they're going to jump in first. But the situation is, first, you can get certified as a group of company. So that's an option, and it's supported, of course, with the certification bodies. What is there to say, addition to that, is that if you are not on the similar level of maturity through those companies, then you will have a problem with certification, because within the process there are going to be selected sample of those offices or countries that are going to be certified, and each of those should provide some level of implementation of this 27K in its own business processes. So basically, when you are selecting who is the one that you want to represent, initially it should be the one that market needs it to be certified, and then try to push as hard as you can in order to push those policies, but implement those policies as well. So definitely that's the focus how to go to.
And on a similar note, but a bit different, what about a company that has multiple locations, right? And that gets a bit more complex because sometimes the various branch offices are operated by different entities or possibly the same entity. So does the location affect the scope as well?
Look, so one company can have one or many locations. There is a bit more complexity when you have the several locations in different countries, of course. But A, it's possible, but B, what is critical, you have to have strong coordination of activities. It's usually from one office. It can be distributed as well, but it is possible to have several locations. It would be advisable to have one main location, but they are heavily influenced from time to time with the different laws. If you are saying that someone is in Europe and someone is somewhere in different parts of the world, then the inputs for that systems can be dramatically different. So,
and the regulations in those countries, which you need to take note
account.
of, exactly, can vary. Okay, changing topic a little bit. Brian, I'll ask you. We mentioned this in the previous Kyte Talk we had as well, where we said that a lot of regulations, or standards, I should say, are pretty much based on each other, or they're based on a common principle, right? So there's a lot of overlap between standards within these different frameworks, right? How does ISO fit in this? How does ISO 27001 help you if you wanted to then get yourself compliant or even certified to even other standards, right, that are possibly related?
Well, having an ISO 27001 certification helps facilitate the process with regards to obtaining certifications of other standards. So if, for example, you have a company which is pursuing the PCI DSS certification with regards to payment card security, their process would be much easier if they already have ISO 27001 controls in place. This not only applies to PCI, you have different sets of standards within ISO. You have ISO 27701 with regards to privacy information. You have ISO 22301 with regards to business continuity, and also ISO 20000 with regards to information technology service management.
yeah, it can also be mentioned that there are several, of course, other standards. There are significantly amount of standards, but there are several regarding the cloud security, 27, 17, and 18. And there are definitely several groups of standards that are supporting implementation of that primary 2701. So once you started with one standard, and that's that one central one, 27.1, to get to the other standard, you have done a good step in that direction.
Yeah, it's good to know that a lot of documentation and processes which you had in place for ISO 27001 can be easily reused or adapted for other standards as well.
Yeah.
And just to continue to this topic, it can be used with those questionnaires that you relatively often receive from your clients, banks or vendors even. So you can definitely use, and you need the central point, which is usually 27.1, in order to address all those questions. So it's a good position to start.
What really gives you the fundamental framework is the fact that once you're doing this, you're already operating a system. So you've got an information security management system already in place. So the business has already at that point got this discipline and got the structure for applying such a standard. So to add the other standards in is a natural progression for those businesses.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Brian, that when you have the framework in place, it prepares you for others. But with ISO, it sets it helps you build those processes so that you're prepared and you implement the necessary information security practices. But ISO does not necessarily stipulate exactly how that gets done, right? But then when you get other standards, like you mentioned PCI, for example, that's much more prescriptive. Then it's good because the process is there. You just have to apply the requirement as it's required by the very standard. So that's definitely a plus.
If I can jump in a bit more, this can also be presented in law situations. So you got the GDPR and the incident requirements. Basically, it's the same incident process, which is then interpreted in GDPR. There is an NIS2 directive as well that is going in the same direction. You're going to get specific requirements and you're going to have to fill them. But the incident process should be the same or similar.
Same. Yeah. Okay, and with obviously the environments keep changing, right? Technology keeps evolving, and of course the standard, even though we'll get to it, the standard has also changed as well, but the requirements are constant. So how are the trends, technologies, I don't know, for example, cloud environments, and various technologies, remote working, which has become something normal. How is this potentially affecting the way we prepare ourselves to get compliant?
Well, with regards to these emerging trends, for example, cloud security, you need to understand the basic measures which would be in place in this regard. So, for example, cloud security, obviously nowadays clients are mostly using cloud environments, so you have processing of data and transactions which are on the cloud. So you need to ensure that these are basically data protected and so on. With regards to teleworking, as you mentioned, this got quite famous since the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are certain measures also to be taken in place where organizations should abide by, etc. So for example, you have people who are working from home, they need to have secure connection and also data encryption and so on.
Yeah.
And secure workplace. This is also the requirement, even if you're not in the company.
Yeah. And, well, you mentioned before, and I asked you about the scope, right, and multiple locations. One can argue that with all these people working from home, a company potentially has all these different locations to consider.
No, from this perspective, it is said that the company's location, such as registered office or business office, is used as an example for the office, and currently the certification bodies are accepting that our work is done from the different locations as such, but we are seeing only one location, for example, on certificate, yes, with a bunch
of course, access, with policies in place to govern the remote connectivity.
The remote works, yeah.
And something good to mention as well with regards to cloud environments, it's important for the organization as well to ensure vendor management is in place. So basically, it's good to note that organizations should check due diligence on the vendors they use for these cloud environments, and also ensure that they also comply with the ISO requirements.
This is a new control in the standard as well. So basically what has also happened is that physical restrictions on client offices were reduced. So you got the increase in IT elements of security, but the physical security has dramatically been minimized.
There's one area where quite often external due diligence questionnaires don't quite match up to what people now do. So while we have to move the standard forward and practices within the standard, you quite often have insurance companies, banks, and they'll ask you about your physical controls. Yep. And we're past having a finance department with a finance server and a segregated network to protect that information. That challenge is dealt with in a more logical fashion within the cloud environment, and the connections there are what's important and not that internal network. And frustratingly, regulated businesses, insurance companies, etc., it's hard to answer the question because you're quite often saying, yeah, we're not doing this, and then they think, well, you're not doing your security properly. So a lot of things that are traditionally things that are said to be the thing you need to do to be secure, yeah, those things no longer really apply, and it's very difficult because the insurance and regulatory industry moves very, very slowly relative to what we're doing in reality with cloud environments.
Which is something that should be seen as a good side of certification position. This is also a traditional part of business, but yes, we do recognize those changes. Several years ago, you wouldn't even consider virtual audits or something like that. This is something that is common now in IT industry, and yes, if you appropriately comment why you're not focusing on physical infrastructure because you're handling it on different cloud infrastructures or whatever, there's the situation, and this is why the certification houses are going in that directions. But as you mentioned, the banks and insurance companies are still traditionally, and what we also can see from their questionnaires is they want to get everything on top level. Physical, top level. Personal security on top level, which is great, but it sometimes is not practical, and you get a lot of...
is a difficulty that's exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the insurances come through brokers, and the brokers are even further behind the insurance companies. So they'll ask you a massive suite of questions that then go and plug into all the insurance companies. And if those questions don't really make sense anymore, then it makes the whole thing more difficult.
It would be easier.
As you say, when they come back to you saying, you know, they want the top for everything, you know, the trouble we're having getting people cyber insurance these days, you know, no matter what certification you've got, just because the insurance companies don't quite understand and the brokers get it wrong as well.
Okay, so let's talk about outsourcing now. How can companies benefit from outsourcing some of those functions, some of those tasks to help themselves get compliant? Are there any particular services that are suited or well suited for outsourcing, and would you suggest outsourcing some of these over trying to do everything in-house?
Well, I mean, companies are going to outsource their IT functions in general, so you're going to have managed service providers. We're seeing a high kind of influx of managed security service providers as well, who give that oversight and allow management of things from central consoles, and that also helps in audits where you can demonstrate that you've got this amount of install base and that you've got this amount of control over the organisation. So there is outsourcing already. We've got outsourced management. We've got a huge dependence on our cloud service providers, for example, from a point of view of normal IT, but it all has to be compliant. In terms of outsourcing the management of information security, we find that organisations aren't ready to do it. They don't have an internal function or a culture of it. So what you can do is, from an outsourced point of view, you can provide a framework. So what we sometimes do, for example, a business comes along and says, we need to get this certification, we have no function, we don't have internal audit, we don't have anything, where do we start? And one of the things that you can do is say, okay, we'll help you to set up the policies, but we'll help you to set up the framework for implementing the policies. So we'll set up a security forum. We'll perhaps, in fact, on an ongoing basis, we will actually schedule and have meetings with them to help them to review the policies, to help them to produce documentation which they're not accustomed to doing, and then have that calendar and hold their hand from a management point of view. And that often will happen until such times as they've grown that function internally so that they can manage their ISMS themselves. But for some organisations, we've been engaged for quite some time, just providing the compliance assistance. One part of it, there's always, I mentioned internal audit briefly there, there's always a need for an external review. So prior to the real audits, you know, we'll often go through and check that we think that everything's going to pass. So that's something we'll do externally for the businesses. We'll then feed back draft policies and procedures for them to adopt prior to the auditor turning up. I guess sometimes you might consider that to be, while we're external, you might consider that to be an internal audit carried out by an external party. You've come across that with us before.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, an internal audit would help organizations, as basically it's an ongoing review, right? So we would check whether your policies and procedures would be in place in time for the certification. In terms of frequency, this is not specified by ISO, but of course, it's mandated to do it regularly, and you can plan it, of course, accordingly.
Yeah.
But partially it's specified you need to do it at least one prior to the certification, and usually it is for the certification practice it requires to do it minimally once per year, but the scope can differ. You don't have to cover everything from time to time. But
and the fact that unless big organizations like banks have an internal audit department, but many don't, right? So on the subject of outsourcing, I would think that the internal audit is a very good candidate for outsourcing, right? Because it has a start and an end, and the responsibilities are very much defined. And of course, it's a very important requirement. It's one of the pillars, I would say. Yeah. So, okay, very good. So we spoke about the requirements, we spoke about the structure. So let's imagine a company has, or an individual has for a number of years tried to convince management that they need to go for ISO, right? And finally they managed, he managed to convince them, let's start the project. Where do we start, right? What are the things that I would need to start looking into, implementing, introducing, buying, hiring? Where do we start?
Well, if it's coming from below to try to convince management, I think that's often an uphill battle. So the technical guys might want to apply these standards, but they're going to have to make a strong business case. So in my experience, it quite often comes from a business imperative. So the business has decided it has to do this. It pulls the poor IT guy in, it explains to them that we need to get this certification, and he's going to be very, very busy.
I'm assuming he's done a good job at convincing them, and now they're convinced, right?
Well, or they've got another business reason why they have to do it. So at that point, trying to set up the organisation to understand what it is that you're trying to do, and that it's not an IT problem, is one of the biggest issues. And I think that the changing in the title of the 27001 standard to include privacy as being part of it, because everyone in Europe is obsessed with GDPR now. So that's quite a good one, because the company is concerned about GDPR risk, obsessed, right? And then you've got the way that they've reorganised the standard as well. You've got organisation and people are the first two parts of it. So that it's really far clearer than having all these different sections to be able to go to management and say, this isn't an IT problem. Like this is about the organisation. This is about the people. I've noticed the HR departments have now started calling themselves things like people and culture. So it should be far easier to explain that initial part to the business. So that helps. That said, the reality is that management's just telling IT to do it, right? So I think that you mentioned resources. It's really got to be something that's taken as an organisation-led project. You have to get the people that are going to be involved in implementing it, such as contracts managers for the outsourcing, such as the DPO, who, by the way, the DPOs are often the one that you want to target because they've been banging the drum already. And then you've got the person who thinks it's important, and then you've got to have head of IT or some infrastructure manager who's bought into it. So it's getting that core group together and making them understand what it means to implement it and what it means to have it, and then you'll find the resource and allocations will flow from that meeting and that group.
And I suppose one of the first questions that we get asked is, how long is this going to take? And I suppose there's no answer to that, right?
No. How long is it going to take? And can we please have a bunch of policies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can we have a
template?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. That does not work. Yeah. Okay, good. So we come to the final step. Let's say we've got ourselves ready. We got consultants that were helping us put in the necessary processes, policies. We performed the internal audit. We performed the mock audit as well to make sure that we're prepared. Everyone's ready, and now we need to call in the certification body to come in and do the real test, right? What does this involve?
Okay. First of all, the certification is visible milestone. So it's important. So that project that you have mentioned now is all coming into one position, which is certification, and there is this first formal view to your following story in information security. So the certification process is done basically in 2 stages, and initially it covers reviewing of those scopes and documentations and internal audits as a confirmation that all areas are covered as required by the certification body. And then you got the stage 2. That means, okay, so you have prepared the policies, so you have identified the scope and every personnel, and then you have to provide the answers and relevant evidence to confirm that this is really working in practice. That process can be strict from time to time because you have to fill in everything. There are also some different levels of your achievements during the audit process. For example, there can be, and I'm always delighted to see a good practice within the company, But sometimes you have to see and you can see position to improve, so opportunities for improvement. And basically, if something is not conforming, then there is a saying non-conformity, that something should be improved even more. That whole process usually takes about certification process as such, so the first audit and the second one, up to a few months period. But it is, when it starts, it is usually done within a week or something like that. So with one auditor or with a group or teams of auditor, they are providing the certification service. So
very good. And very quickly, there's a new version of the standard. I suppose the certification process does not change that much, right?
Yeah, the certification process remains the same, but the requirements are a bit different. So basically, the company that has already been certified against the current standard is doing the transition audit, while the new companies are going to get certified against new standard requirements.
Very good. Guys, that's all the time we have. This was a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for the information you've provided. It has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode of Kyte Talks.